The Statue of Liberty's torch has been closed to visitors for more than a century. Most people hear the reason and treat it like trivia. An explosion damaged it in 1916. That answer is true. It is also incomplete. The torch was not closed because one monument was unlucky. It was closed because before America entered the First World War, New York Harbor was already part of someone else's war. No enemy aircraft crossed the harbor. No battleship fired on the city. No army landed on the docks. The blast came from New Jersey, from Black Tom, from a railroad yard, a pier, a line of barges and freight cars packed with war materials waiting for ships. The public memory kept the scar, the damaged statue, the closed torch. But the deeper story is the machine that put the scar there. How did a neutral American port become a battlefield before the United States had the laws, agencies, or habits of mind to defend it? At Black Tom, the warning was not a secret message. It was geography. A munitions depot stood beside one of the most famous harbors in the world. Explosives and ammunition waited in warehouses, railroad cars, and barges. Civilian families slept on nearby Bedloes Island, the Army garrison stationed there for the Statue of Liberty compound, with women and children quartered in the fort's residential sections. Immigrants were detained at Ellis Island, waiting in a federal processing facility less than a mile from the largest concentration of war materials on the eastern seaboard. None of them had been asked whether that proximity was acceptable. Lower Manhattan sat across the water. On a map, the danger was almost too obvious. On paper, it was business. Black Tom was not a quiet place in 1916. It was part of a vast export system. The Lehigh Valley Railroad moved material to the waterfront. The National Docks and Storage Company handled buildings and pier space. Ships waited to carry supplies overseas. The United States was officially neutral. But neutrality did not mean stillness. American companies could legally sell munitions to nations at war. In practice, most of those arms went to the Allies because Britain controlled the sea lanes Germany needed. So the harbor became a contradiction. Neutral in law, partial in logistics. Germany did not have to invade the United States to see the problem. It only had to look at the waterfront. By the summer of 1916, the danger at Black Tom was not one crate, one barge, or one careless guard. It was concentration. War materials were held in one place because ships were scarce, and movement had to be timed. Explosives sat in freight cars. Ammunition sat in barges. Warehouses stood close enough that one fire could become a chain. The old language of docks and freight hid the new reality. This was an arsenal beside a city. The harbor was modern. The law around it was not. I read the official FBI history as a story about institutional limits, not only espionage. The Bureau of Investigation existed, but it was small. Its authority was narrow. The Secret Service could investigate some German plots by presidential order. The New York Police Department had experienced bomb detectives. But the country did not yet have the national security machinery it would later take for granted. That gap is the first part of the disaster. The second part is the map. Rail lines made the pier useful. Warehouses made delay possible. Barges made the cargo mobile. The harbor made the cargo international. Every layer solved a business problem. Together, they created a security problem no single company was built to solve. The railroad could move cars. The storage company could hold goods. The fire department could answer a visible alarm. The police could arrest men after a rule had been broken. But no local actor was designed to see the full chain. Cargo concentration, civilian proximity, private logistics, weak federal law, and a foreign enemy who understood the map. That is the model for this episode, 5 failures. One harbor, one night. Shortly after midnight on July 30th, 1916, fire appeared at the Black Tom Pier. Contemporary reporting described the first alarm almost absurdly small. Some rubbish burning. Fire companies were sent toward the pier. Then the scale changed. They saw freight cars, barges, warehouse buildings. Flame where flame could not remain local. The exact first ignition still belongs to the evidence problem. Later official and legal records treated Black Tom as sabotage by German agents. Early investigators first chased negligence, illegal mooring, and storage violations. Both parts matter. The later sabotage finding explains why the fire began. The storage pattern explains why it became an urban-scale explosion. At about 2 in the morning, the first major blast struck the harbor. The National Park Service places the second and largest explosion at about 2:05 a.m. The FBI describes 2 million pounds of war materials blowing up in the Black Tom Railroad yard. Timekeeping differs slightly across accounts. The sequence does not. Fire became detonation. The detonation became a wave. The wave crossed water faster than anyone could organize a response. On Bedloe's Island, Captain Alfred T. Clifton of the Army Signal Corps was awakened, according to the National Park Service account. He ordered a general alarm. Women and children were moved toward the east side of Fort Wood, away from the side facing Black Tom. Use that image carefully, not as a scene of imagined panic, as a spatial fact. The families were close enough to the explosion that the safest place was not a house. It was the stone geometry under the Statue of Liberty. The blast shattered glass across the island. Debris fell for hours. The Statue of Liberty took fragments on the side facing Black Tom. The shock wave pushed the torch arm against the crown and damaged internal framework. The torch stayed lit. That is almost the cruelest visual detail in the record. The symbol kept shining while the structure beneath the symbol was being damaged by a war supply chain the country had not yet named as a home front battlefield. Across the harbor, Lower Manhattan and Jersey City absorbed the shock. Thousands of windows broke. People who did not know the source thought first of an earthquake, a bomb at police headquarters, or a disaster inside their own streets. The map now becomes the story. Black Tom was not isolated. Tracks fed the pier. Barges clustered along the water. Warehouses formed a storage wall. Liberty Island and Ellis Island stood nearby. Manhattan was close enough for glass to become evidence. This was not one explosion in empty space. It was stored energy placed beside connection. And that is why the first explanation was too small. Contemporary newspapers moved quickly toward the cause easiest to prosecute. Someone had mishandled dangerous cargo. The Sun reported manslaughter warrants for railroad, lighterage, and storage officials. It described a lighter loaded with ammunition, a forbidden mooring, and arguments over whether it should have stayed at the pier overnight. This was not foolish. It was what the visible evidence offered. There had been a fire. There were rules. There were people responsible for docks, barges, and storage. But those were local facts. The later record forced a larger question. Could a foreign government reach into a neutral country's infrastructure and turn ordinary logistics into a weapon? In 1916, the United States did not yet have a complete answer. The Mixed Claims Commission eventually held that German sabotage agents were responsible for the destruction of Black Tom Terminal and the Kingsland plant. Germany was held liable, but that finding did not arrive in the first week. It came after years of litigation, after earlier proceedings dismissed claims against Germany, and after arguments over testimony, documents, and responsibility. The delay matters. The United States had to prove that a disaster everyone could see belonged to an operation almost no one could see clearly at the time. That is why the sabotage should be spoken with confidence, but not with theatrical simplicity. Black Tom was not solved in the first morning. The legal record had to catch up with the event. The FBI's own history says the country had few national security laws and no real intelligence community to stop German agents. It says the Bureau's predecessor was limited by size and jurisdiction. That is not a footnote. It is the mechanism. A modern war was using private supply lines. The government watching those lines had not yet built modern tools. The explosion killed 4 people in the FBI's account, 3 men and a baby. Other accounts give higher totals, often 5 or 7, depending on later deaths and classification. The safe way to say it is that at least 4 people died, and that casualty counts vary across sources. The number is not small because the blast was small. It is small because of timing. The explosion came in the early morning hours of a Sunday. The docks were not crowded as they would have been during a workday. That accident of time prevented the casualty list from matching the physical scale. Still, the human record should not disappear into the monument. The FBI preserves a baby among the dead. The National Park Service records families on Bedloe's Island moving for protection. It records detainees and staff on Ellis Island being ferried away. These are the people the map must hold, not invented voices, not imagined last moments. Just civilians placed inside the radius of a war they had not been asked to join. After the blast, the damage became easier to see than the responsibility. 13 warehouses were reported destroyed in contemporary coverage. The Library of Congress preserves a sandborne map showing ammunition, storage facilities, industrial plants, warehouses, railroad tracks, wharves, and piers damaged by the operation. That map is one of the best ways to understand the event. It turns a famous explosion back into a chain. Tracks, piers, warehouses, barges, water, civilian islands, city glass. The Statue of Liberty became the memory hook because it is impossible to miss. The National Park Service says the torch has been closed since the Black Tom explosion. That fact is true. It is also incomplete. If the episode stops there, it becomes trivia. The better question is why a symbol of American safety was physically damaged by a conflict that American law still treated as someone else's war. The answer is not that the country was secretly at war. The answer is more ordinary and more useful. Neutrality governed declarations. It did not empty railroad cars. It did not separate barges. It did not invent counterintelligence jurisdiction. It did not make a port less valuable to foreign agents. After the United States entered the war, Congress passed the Espionage Act and later the Sabotage Act. The Bureau gained a clearer national security role. The FBI history links Black Tom and other German intrigues to that expansion of law and jurisdiction. That does not mean Black Tom alone created the modern security state. History is rarely that neat. It means Black Tom showed the weakness in a way broken windows could measure. The record also complicates easy blame. Yes, later findings placed responsibility on German agents, and Germany paid reparations. But the disaster became inevitable because hostile action met a vulnerable arrangement. Saboteurs needed access. They also needed concentration. They needed a target worth attacking. They needed a harbor where war material could sit close to civilian life. They needed an American system still treating sabotage as an extraordinary crime rather than a normal risk of modern war. That is the responsibility chain. Foreign agents supplied the intent. The war economy supplied the cargo. The harbor supplied the geography. Private logistics supplied the concentration. Weak national security law supplied the opening. Remove one link and the story changes. Leave them together and the first flame has almost too much help. I am willing to argue that the early accident explanation was not merely wrong. It was too small for the world that had arrived. It could name a lighter. It could name a dock. It could name a rule. It could not yet name the fact that New York Harbor had become part of a global battlefield. That is why Black Tom feels forgotten, even though its most famous scar remains open to the public by being closed to it. Visitors can climb to the crown. They cannot climb into the torch. Most will learn a short reason, an explosion, damage, closure. But the closed torch is not only a maintenance fact, it is an archive in metal. It records a night when distance failed. Europe's war reached a New Jersey pier. A New Jersey pier reached Liberty Island. Liberty Island reached the story America told about itself. The disaster did not begin when the war materials exploded beside New York Harbor. It began when a neutral country allowed its harbor to become a concentrated war supply machine without building the legal and investigative defenses that machine required. The Statue of Liberty was damaged because it stood close to the blast. Black Tom matters because the country stood close to the war and kept calling that distance safety.